This is the My Campaign Coach podcast, where we talk about how to win elections. Every week, we let you hear straight from the best consultants, operatives, and candidates in the game, all for one reason, to help you win. For more information about how we can help you win, visit mycampaigncoach.com. Now, here's your host, Raj Schaefer.
Welcome to the How to Run for Office podcast from My Campaign Coach. Campaign Sidekick helps make this podcast possible, and they also provide the best way for campaigns to contact voters. It's an incredible suite of tools, and you can find out more and schedule a demo at campaignsidekick.vote. Today we're talking to the man behind Ted Cruz's social media success, Mr. Josh Perry. Josh is an alumni of the University of Texas at Austin and has been working full-time in conservative politics since his graduation. Prior to that, Josh was heavily involved with Young Conservatives of Texas and used a lot of his free time to promote conservative causes. Back in January of 2011, now Senator Cruz hired Josh when he was still a long-shot startup candidate with a single-digit name ID and only a few more digits in his campaign bank account. Now, Josh has been with the senator ever since, through his first campaign and winning the Senate seat, the years in the Senate, the presidential primary, and now as the road to Senate reelection begins here in the 2018 cycle. And through each of those chapters, Josh has been critical to the shape and direction of Cruz's message, especially when it comes to the ever and increasingly important digital realm. There's a lot that we want to cover today, and we're probably going to have to bring Josh on later this year to talk specifically about the presidential campaign. But I think we got some great stuff. We're going to have a lot of fun with this episode today. With that, Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Raz, for having me. Great to be able to talk with you today.
Well, it's always a pleasure. You and I have got lots of chances, both on and off the record over the years, to spend time together as fellow Cruz alum, and I'm excited to get some of these stories shared around, because a lot of our purpose here at this podcast is to share a lot about how people can get involved and about the stories of success and failure, and we've had plenty of both of those on the road with Cruz, and so I'm excited to specifically talk about the Senate race today. Before we get too far into that, though, let's start by going back a little bit. You're a native of Nederland, Texas, out there on about as far east as you can get near Port Arthur. How did you go from being out there and growing up to being involved in politics and going with YCT when you were in college?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, like you mentioned, it's way out in East Texas. I'm basically in Southwest Louisiana at that point, but right there.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, almost everyone from my high school, they aspired to go to Texas A&M. And, I was going through high school kind of hoping I'd try to get my way over to the Air Force Academy to go fly planes. And as we can see, that kind of turned out a different way than
God has interesting plans.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the way things turn out. Certainly been for the better here lately. But anyway, did end up doing the Air Force Academy, and decided to look at the University of Texas at Austin. I had always kind of been interested in government, but even at that time, I had no idea that was something I wanted to do long-term career-wise. But anyway, I applied, made it in, showed up to campus in, 2006. And really for me, I'd kind of thought I was a conservative, but I just hadn't really thought about it all that much. I thought of myself, more as a Republican at that point, but I probably couldn't have expressed why. But I was walking around on campus one of my first few days there, and I see of the two groups, they have both College Republicans and Young Conservatives of Texas on campus. And of the two groups there, Young Conservatives of Texas were the ones actually out there trying to actively recruit people. So they drew me in. I went to a meeting. I got to talk to these guys, folks who were new like me, folks who've been around for a few years, and got to hear about the things they were getting to do. And, when you're showing up to college in Austin, Texas, one of the great things about going to school there is the state capitol's right there. And every 2 years, the state legislature meets, and they're talking about, we can get you involved with internships right now. You can go over, you'll have chances to lobby and meet with members of the Texas House of Representatives, the Texas Senate. And, being this 18-year-old kid in this new city, this sounds all really good to me, and it caught my attention instantly. So I just got more involved with YCT, served as their executive director there for 2 years, my junior and senior year, and just kind of had the opportunity to visit a lot of the state of Texas, get involved in the grassroots block walking, phone banking, and everything for conservative candidates around the state. And a very consequential state convention I went to, and I believe it was our 2009, it may have been 2008 state convention. this guy who was considering running for Attorney General in the state of Texas was one of our keynote speakers for the event, and he was Ted Cruz. And I just remember specifically listening to him speak and thinking to myself, whatever this guy runs for at some point, I want to do whatever I can to help him get elected.
Yeah, and you did.
And we did. At the time, he was looking for Attorney General, and like I had known the campaign manager, John Drogan, because he was on Senator Cornyn's reelection campaign in 2008, and I was an intern for that campaign. So we had known each other. At that point, I think he still referred to me as Alligator Boy rather than my own name. But
we got to have Drogan on this podcast sometime soon. He's quite the character and was one heck of a campaign manager. So we'll have him on and bring out the Drogan Slogans Handbook when we do that.
Got to do that. But anyway, so I knew John Drogan from there, and like I basically called him up and say, hey, I want to just like come intern and volunteer and everything. So at that point, the campaign for Attorney General that ultimately wasn't to come into fruition was operated out of a closet, and like a storage closet, and I'd show up and I'd stuff envelopes, help edit video and everything for the campaign, just whatever I could do to just kind of get my foot in the door, and felt like I was making an impact in that race. So obviously the Attorney General race kind of hinged upon whether or not Kay Bailey Hutchison was going to resign her U.S. Senate seat and allow some shuffling in the statewide offices. And when that didn't happen in the gubernatorial race in 2010, Greg Abbott stayed in his role, and then Attorney General Abbott was Ted Cruz's boss whenever he was Solicitor General, so he had no interest in running against him. So that race just never came to be when that spot never came open.
Yeah, there was this whole domino thing that was happening in Texas politics. You know, KBH was, Senator Hutchison was looking to potentially, it was run for governor, right? Is it, no,
yes.
It was run for governor, challenging Perry. And if she did that, then that was going to leave a Senate seat, which, you know, we thought that Dewhurst would get appointed to, and then then Attorney General Abbott at the time would get, he would be going for light gov, and so the open spot on that totem pole would be Attorney General, which Cruz, as the former number 2 guy, would be perfectly qualified for. But instead what happened was KBH, she wasn't going to run for re-election either, so it left that her Senate seat was going to be open. So it's kind of complicated, but basically Ted ended up running for Senate instead of Attorney General, and it worked out pretty well for everybody.
Yeah. So yeah, I just had to wait the 2 years instead of 2010. It ended up being 2012, and things obviously worked out fairly well there. So, you know, went to a couple years where, you know, weren't running, but I recalled getting a call from Drogan. It's probably towards the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, kind of feeling me out to see if I'd be interested in coming on full time to help Ted Cruz run for this U.S. Senate seat being vacated by Kay Bailey Hutchison that you just mentioned. And I was just like, yes, absolutely. Like, whatever I can do, whatever capacity, I don't care. Like, I just want to be involved. So at the time I was hired, I was the third person hired. There was John Drogan, a finance director, and and me. And I was basically the online guy, the digital guy, the guy who fixed the copier, and the driver. Which luckily I didn't have to do for too much longer.
Just tell us why you didn't have to do that part for too much longer.
So of all things, the night of the first debate in the Senate race, this was, I want to say it had to have been July of 2011. There's still a lot of candidates who hadn't even gotten into the race yet. David Dewhurst hadn't gotten into the race yet. But the Texas Tribune was holding the first candidate forum/debate in Austin. And I was with Cruz in Houston. We were at a lunch a couple blocks from his office, and drove us there. We went to this lunch. I think we stopped back by his law office for a few minutes, and we were leaving the law office to head to Austin for this debate that night. And geez, it wasn't even 3 blocks away from his law office that I'm driving down the road, and like we're having a conversation. I'm looking down the road, and then all of a sudden I look up above me and notice the light is red. I look to the left and I see there's a car coming, and there's no way for me to get out of the way. So I kind of get T-boned in the side, pull off to the side of the road. Does quite the number on my car, but Cruz was great. Luckily, it was my side of the car that got hit and not his. But it was, interestingly enough, after that event that it was decided that maybe I shouldn't focus on driving and I should focus a little bit more on digital and online from that point on.
Well, I'll tell you, there was right after the fertilizer plant explosion in West, midway through our time together in the Senate, I was having to drive Ted from the DFW airport down to go tour the explosion site with Senator Cornyn. And I was having to go with a state trooper escort. We were literally driving down 35, flashers on, less than a car length between me and the trooper, and cruising at about 95. We've been in and out of traffic. I was so sure that I was going to kill myself and the senator and probably so many other people. And so your situation came back and forth through my mind that day. I was like, well, at least I won't be the first one, but this is going to be so much worse if I mess up. So I was like, they're going to tell you telling this story a lot longer and probably in a lot worse way than with Josh's. But yeah, so that opened the door to you get to spend a lot more time on Twitter and running the digital side of things, kind of expanding that role.
Yeah, so like I said, got to do a lot more of those things. And at the time, like, one of the ways we really looked at Facebook and Twitter and social media just in general is that not just as something you do on a campaign, but you do it in conjunction with your media strategy, because running in Texas is expensive. At the time, I believe it was $1.1 million for a week of statewide TV in Texas. And when you're an upstart candidate who's running against the sitting lieutenant governor, who the entire state of Texas, who has money, basically who has business before the state legislature, has a financial incentive and a real incentive to not support you. So we knew that we would be outspent. We knew we'd probably be outspent by a lot. So we had to be smart about where we invested resources and the ways we reached people. And we knew that social media was a good way to be able to supplement our paid TV and our paid radio and our ad buys online to, I guess, utilize supporters and our grassroots online to talk to their friends and encourage them to check out Ted and encourage them to vote for Ted.
Well, and you guys from very early on, you knew that you were up against a fight that nobody said you could win. I mean, as far as the powers that be, traditional, conventional wisdom, it said Ted Cruz cannot win this race. It's really hard to kind of think back at that now because we think, oh yeah, Ted Cruz, senator, nearly became a Republican nominee for president, all these things. But we think back to 2011, Ted Cruz is running there. He literally has like a 2% name ID. That's not how many people supported him in the state. That's how many people knew who the hell Ted Cruz was. Yeah. And that's really, it's crazy how far we've come. But at that point, you guys are looking at this and saying, we have a fraction of the budget that somebody like Dave Dewhurst that could write the check for however many tens of millions of dollars he wanted to spend. You're up against that kind of Goliath. You look at this and say, we have to do this campaign in a different way. It has to be political asymmetrical warfare. And so you guys built this whole entire strategy from you and Drogan and McClellan, all of y'all built a strategy to go at it from a very, very different direction, starting off with announcing your campaign on a blogger call rather than at some big campaign event. I mean, from the beginning, this was a very innovative campaign.
Yeah, so like you said, we knew we had to do things differently. We had to capture people's attentions in a different way. We had to reach people in a different way, like you said, starting with the blogger call. And then, like, even an example of, like, one of the things that seems really silly, but there was a very good reason that we did it, was one of the things that we kept hammering throughout the Senate campaign was that David Dewhurst was skipping all the candidate forums and debates and everything.
Dewhurst.
Ducking Dewhurst. And, like, you could send out a press release about this every day, but most people in the press don't care. Like, they're like, okay, fine, what's it matter? But what they do care about is when you're going to these candidate forums and the sitting lieutenant governor isn't showing up, when there's a 6-foot-tall duck standing outside holding a sign that says Ducking Dewhurst, which whenever I was traveling the state, in addition to being the driver, I was also dressing up as a duck.
You wore a lot of hats, including one of a duck.
No job too big or too small.
That's right. It's a good lesson for everybody listening. Do the job that needs to be done, whether you're excited about it or not. If it's got to be done, do it.
Yeah. So the local press would show up, and ordinarily, like they don't care that much about a local forum with a bunch of political candidates they've never heard of before. But what they do care about is someone dressed up as a duck outside of this event. So, like, almost without exception, like you'd end up seeing pictures of this 6-foot-tall duck holding a ducking Dewhurst sign. And that captured attention and got picked up in the local media. So that was one of the ways that we could break through and message to people. Make the point that the sitting lieutenant governor wasn't coming out, that Ted Cruz was. So that was one of the fun things I got to do quite a few times. I will say I thought it was hot in Texas in August and September, but I found that it's especially hot in August and September when you're dressed up in a giant duck costume.
This is a fact.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's got to be quite warm, especially when you're down in the Houston area.
Houston, and actually one of the worst was Tyler. I love Tyler, don't get me wrong, but that day it happened to be especially hot, and like by the time I got out of that costume, it was drenched. And I wish I still knew where that costume was. Next time you talk to Tyler Norris, please give him hell for me, because he was the last one to have seen it, and like I feel like this should be in a museum at some point somewhere.
No doubt. Yeah, that's gonna be a special museum piece at some point. Wow. So you guys built this whole campaign, from the ducking Dewhurst to the I'll have to include a link in the show notes to the Chupacabra ad, which is kind of more on the same thing of Dewhurst was never showing up, didn't want to engage, which it's pretty traditional for the guy that has the most money and the most name ID. He doesn't want to go out and engage. So you guys had to draw him in and basically say, look, we're going to keep pounding you for being a coward and ducking all this interaction and not want to get in front of the people until you actually show up. And of course, what happened, because Ted was ready when that occurred, he shellacked him. But even before we got Dewhurst involved, you guys were heavily engaged, as far as your new media strategy, making sure that every bit of earned media that you got, whether it's print or TV or radio, was absolutely just magnified across every possible medium you had in the new medium world. How did you kind of build that strategy? What did that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so I mean, we'd keep an eye on, and at that time, we certainly got a lot less TV than we do these days. But we'd keep an eye out on news clippings, news stories, like you said, radio, and try and think of good creative ways to package them, whether it was like a roundup, in case you missed it, of like several good articles where we'd pull out quotes to be able to send to our supporters. Because like one of the things we really wanted to make sure was that if someone was a supporter of Ted Cruz and they wanted to go and make the case for someone else why they should also be supporters of Ted Cruz, we wanted to make sure they had ample, I guess, resources and examples of things to give to people, and I guess clippings of him out in the press, and just we wanted them to be able to make the case in a way that was comfortable for them. So you mentioned like we'd highlight quotes. One of the things that we had at every single event we went to and put out on every chair that we went to was just a what they're saying about Ted printout document that people could take home with them. And, they had people from like George Will to Mark Levin to Glenn Beck to Rush Limbaugh. Just what they're saying about Ted, why they think he's the conservative fighter we need in the U.S. Senate, to make sure that people had these types of things to be able to say, hey, you like Glenn Beck, this is what he's saying about Ted. Or, hey, you listen to Mark Levin, the great one, every night, this is what he's saying about Ted. And then in addition, whenever, he'd appear on these radio shows and everything, one of the things we made sure to do every time without exception is there's a great tool, and I'll see if I can find it, and maybe it'd be helpful for anyone who's listening on your podcast, that allows you to record radio interviews live in real time. And that way you're able to cut the radio interview, you're able to take the audio and put it on a video slider and upload it to YouTube, so that way your friends can share it and supporters can share it. And capturing all those things to make sure that our people had more than they needed to be able to share with their friends was just absolutely critical. Like we mentioned, and I'll keep mentioning over and over, because I know a lot of people who are thinking about running for office or thinking about getting involved, you're not always going to be the most well-financed campaign, but that's not the most important thing. It's what you do with the resources you have. I mean, even in the presidential campaign, we knew we'd never have the most money, but we stuck around for quite a bit. And I think made a pretty decent run for it. Things didn't turn out quite the way we had hoped it would, but I mean, you had a candidate like Jeb who came in with a $100 million war chest and a super PAC and was gone by South Carolina. Yep. It's about what you do with the money you have and spending it wisely, being incredibly frugal, which we were, whether it was, flying Southwest all the time when we had to fly. If we could drive, we would drive. But one of the things that we went out of our way to do was, I don't think that there was a single event request that Senator Cruz received during the Senate campaign in which he was able to attend that he did not attend.
He was everywhere. I mean, it's truly impressive. And during that time, I was working for the Madison Project and doing some C3 work, and a lot of my job was going around to these Republican Party and Tea Party meetings and Republican Women's Meeting. And Ted and I were seeing each other about twice a week, different parts of the state, because he just everywhere that there was a 5-woman blue-haired Republican women's organization or a Tea Party out in the middle of nowhere that had 3 people show up once a month. I mean, they wanted Ted to be there, he would be there. There was no organization or group too large or too small for him to show up for. And that did so much because nobody does that. I mean, nobody of Ted Cruz's caliber, nobody's running for U.S. Senate had ever done that around here in Texas. But he knew that if he wasn't going to be able to get on TV and he wasn't going to be on the radio every chance he wanted to, there was one way he could get in front of folks, and that was to show up. Yeah. And he did that every chance he got.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm especially proud of him doing, which from a scheduling perspective was kind of a nightmare sometimes, but whenever we'd have these events at night, he would be the last person out every time without exception. As long as someone wanted to talk, he was more than happy to be there speaking with them, hearing their concerns, answering any questions they have, and then almost without exception, if it was the last event of the night, he'd ask, was there an IHOP or a Denny's or something we can go to afterwards? And he'd take anyone who was left over there, and we'd continue the conversation there. And sometimes these went till 2 and 3 in the morning, which when you have a 6 a.m. flight the next day makes things interesting. But he was happy to do it. He enjoyed it. Like you said, when you're not going to be in front of TV cameras and you're not going to be on the radio as much as you like one of the best things you can have are people who are willing to vouch for you and feel passionately about you and support you and are willing to go and make the case for you. And making these personal connections like that go a long way to creating that.
He did a masterful job of that. And the great thing about Ted is that those were all genuine. He was not just sitting there on his phone, calculating up how many votes he got that day when you're headed back from the IHOP. Every one of those interactions, it was one, he was having a blast. He was absolutely loving his time on the campaign trail. 2, he absolutely just thrives on meeting and connecting with people. And especially these conservatives who shared his vision for what needed to happen and were passionate about helping promote their collective view of what our government needed to do, what we were seeing that we didn't like, and how we wanted to change that. And it was truly incredible because the enthusiasm that we got to see from Maggie Wright, driving her wrapped car and putting out signs all over the state. Just the number of stories coming out of that campaign, that many of which Ted talked about on the stump for a long time after. It's just truly inspiring to see how many of these Tea Party folks, whether it's folks that were limited to activism online or showed up in the real world, putting out signs and knocking on doors and making phone calls, tens of thousands of calls and thousands of block walking hours. It's just truly inspiring. Going through that entire campaign was amazing.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, people who are passionate supporters, Kenneth DePew, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the very first interactions I had with him was, I believe it was Ted himself who pulled out his phone and shows me this thing on Facebook where a supporter of ours in Houston, we didn't have bumper stickers yet because we didn't have bumper stickers for months because, like I mentioned, we were cheap.
They're expensive.
Yeah. They're expensive to print. You hand them out. Most of them don't end up going on cars after all. So we're like, well, we're spending money on other things. We're trying to get them to events. But anyway, we didn't have bumper stickers yet. Ted pulls out his phone and shows me a picture on Facebook of a guy who painted the back window of his car with our logo. And it was Kenneth DePew at the time, who ultimately came to work for us, was a huge supporter. But I mean, you just saw things like that over and over the state of Texas. Like you mentioned with Maggie Wright wrapping her car. It's really great to see people who are this passionate in politics and who there are people and they're proud to support people at a level that they are like this. I know one of the things that kind of is a little disheartening is I guess sometimes the political rhetoric gets caustic and it gets people to kind of tune things out. But now it's more important than ever to have people who are passionate about these types of things in politics. we have quite the opportunity in Congress right now, and it's important to hold Republicans' feet to the fire and make sure they deliver on things like repealing Obamacare. And that's why it's so important we have elected people like Ted right now, who we know we can trust to do those things.
Well, and that's where we start to see, especially once we get these guys elected, we start seeing what they're made of. Because it's very easy to make campaign promises on the when you're out there, you're asking folks for votes. It's a totally other ball game to actually be there in the Senate and actually executing on this in a situation where it's always not as popular as we might hope. And Ted, especially right now with the Obamacare fight, that being one of the signature things he ran on in that 2012 election, is doing a phenomenal job there. Now, let's look back towards the new media side. So as you're in that campaign, you guys were really – it was kind of an exciting time of new media and figuring out new ways to use them in elections. And you guys were really on the cutting edge of that throughout that election cycle. Talk to us a little bit more about some of the things you guys were using and discovered, some of the new techniques you guys used through that process.
Yeah. And pardon me if I conflate a little bit, because I get 2016 and 2012.
The years run together. That's fine.
Yeah, well, one of the strangest things was looking at someone who posted one of those time hop photos of 4 years ago visiting Ted's brand new Senate office, and it's hard for me to believe that was 4 years ago now. I mean, 2013 doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but yeah, that's when we were opening up shop there. But yeah, whenever it came to new media, one of the things we wanted to focus on, the two things we were most focused on were Facebook and Twitter. I mean, Instagram wasn't really around then. It may have been, but it was still coming up, and no one really used it on politics. Snapchat definitely didn't exist at that point yet. But we knew that we'd be able to reach people through bloggers, through Facebook, through Twitter, and their roles have gotten a little bit, I guess, more defined since then. We were still trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the best way to use these platforms now? I think if you're using them now, Facebook, I guess, is probably more along the lines of your modern day coffee shop, if you will, where you've got friends talking to their friends, sharing articles and saying, hey, this is what I saw about, Ted Cruz or whatever it is. This is what I saw about Obamacare. And there's the personal, I guess, touch there in that you're hearing these things and you're seeing them shared from people you know and people who use opinions you trust. So that's important for that. And I think that's one of the best, people reaching a lot of people platforms there is still. But Twitter it has kind of taken a new role, I guess, here recently that it somewhat existed then, but it's more prominent now in that I think that's a great platform to reach your influencers. I don't think it's necessarily a platform that's going to allow you to reach millions of people in the same way that Facebook is. But it is a great way to make sure that people who do have a platform to speak and who do have audiences, that they see what you're saying. And that's radio hosts, it's journalists, it's just conservative opinion leaders to make sure that, they're seeing your stuff and they're talking about it at their next Tea Party meeting or something like that. So, we were kind of all just feeling all that out at that point. I know you had Obama in 2008 where everyone talked about how great he was at social media. And I think that part of it was that he was just willing to use it all and play with it and see what worked. And that's kind of what we wanted to do. In 2012, we didn't want to leave any stones unturned because, like we said, we knew we wouldn't have the resources that our opponent would. And, if this was a platform that allowed us, and one of the things that is really simple to do is every email you send out, have tweets and Facebook posts set up to where all they have to do is click and it automatically shares. And we'd find it silly for every email to not include that because it's another way for you to get your messaging out to people and have it come from someone that people know and people trust.
And one of the things kind of tying into what you're saying there is that I think a lot of the, I guess, more established consultants and politicians, the people that you're running against, that part of their hesitation was that they thought that social media was still optional. They felt like it was not something they had to do. And so if they had a choice between doing something they're uncomfortable with and might screw up or might make mistakes on, that if they could play error-free ball by just ignoring it, they thought that they would win. And they didn't think they had to engage in that space. And what you guys did was you showed, no, this is not optional anymore. And you knew that for your purposes, having to play that asymmetrical warfare, you knew that you had to win there. You had to do well. And so you said, look, we're going to be okay with minor mess ups or doing something once figured out. We don't want to do that again. But we're going to engage. We're going to test it. We're going to figure out how we make these connections.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that we really like to do is, like, as much as possible, we wanted to see, and not only is it an opportunity to speak out and get your message out, but it's also like these platforms I loved, and I wish I could still do this to the extent now, but you could also see what people were talking about, see what people cared about. When I had the text and feed on my tweet deck, that I would love looking at it just to seeing what issues are popping with people, what people are caring about, and like actually make an effort to engage with them when we could, or when people are just simply asking questions, responding and giving them answers to things. I will say I remember specifically, this is just an interesting tidbit. One of the things we mentioned, we weren't going to have the resources and all that, but we knew that there were going to be some outside groups that we were going to have to court and get their support to be able to actually compete at a level that would make us competitive. And one of the groups that we knew that we were working really hard to get was Club for Growth, along with Senate Conservatives Fund, who both played a large role in electing some of the Tea Party folks in 2010. So I happened to be driving back from Austin to Nederland for my sister's high school graduation, and I was scrolling through Twitter on my phone, which I shouldn't have been as I was driving, but there are long stretches of nothing in between, so it was just kind of like entertained myself. And I recalled like looking at my phone, scrolling through our feed, and seeing that like out of almost nowhere, Club for Growth had endorsed Ted Cruz. And this was something that we were like working up to for months now. And it was just a really nice surprise in that like I didn't know it was coming. And it was one of those moments where I thought, wow, we are actually doing what we need to do to win. Like, we have a path forward. It's still not easy, but this is exactly what we needed to happen. I guess another interesting thing that we got really fortunate in that the election was originally scheduled for, what was it? I think it was March 2nd in 2012.
Yeah, good old Wendy Davis kicking those maps out had to force us back by a couple months.
Yeah, so our election was originally scheduled for March 2nd, and at that point we were not anywhere close to where we were in support in the polling that we were by the time the primary was actually held, and I guess it was May 27th or 29th of 2012. But as a result of the redistricting lawsuits that went on, the primary got pushed back, which was extremely fortunate for us because at that point I think we held David to under the 50% he needed to get the nomination by maybe 2 or 3 points.
It was close. It was very close.
If it weren't for that lawsuit, we could definitely be looking at something different there. But
yes, we got very, very fortunate because we needed every day we could to get the word out and get every vote possible. Because the trend, we were consistently trending in a positive direction. But the fear was that if we had the election in March, then Dewhurst might not be held below 50%, which would mean no runoff and no opportunity for us. Because we felt like we were in second place solidly, but if Dewhurst wasn't below 50, then it was game over. And so those extra 2 months gave us exactly as much time we needed with very few days to spare. It put us in second position with Dewhurst under 50 going into the runoff, and then went and cleaned up.
Yeah, I don't know if you recall, well, I'm sure you remember, the state convention after the primary election. Like, I knew things were going the direction we needed them, but at that point, we still got beat by quite a few points. We were in second place, but he was fairly close to 50%. So, it was not a lock at that point that we were going to win. But I remember getting to the state convention and seeing the level of support and enthusiasm from the grassroots Republicans there at the convention, and just seeing like how the crowd went wild when Ted went on. Seeing how many people I don't remember how many stickers we ordered, like lapel stickers we ordered for the convention, but we ordered more than we thought we needed, and we ran out within 24 hours of getting there, and had to order more and have them shipped to the convention center. Doing the little things to just make sure the visuals were right. I recall we went out, and every convention since then, we set the bar too high, I think. Every state convention since then, we put rally signs on every seat there, so that way whenever he's speaking, we're able to get the visuals of people like raising up the signs and making sure it looks good for pictures and video cameras. I'll just I'll never forget walking around and seeing, 80 to 90% of the people there all wearing Ted Cruz for Senate stickers. And that's when I finally looked around, I saw this, and I was like, yeah, we're going to win. Like, it's not even close. Like, these are the people we need engaged and active right now, and they're all with us. It was really
incredible.
Yeah.
It was at that point that I kind of had the same feeling. I was like, holy crap, we're going to do this. It's going to happen. It was just amazing. And the depression on the face of the Dewhurst staffers was kind of beautiful at that point, but that's kind of mean of me to say, but it felt good. All right, so coming out of that convention, Ted wins. He wins the runoff. Runs with that. He goes and cleans up in November, and now all of a sudden, you and I are getting hired to work in the Senate office, and we're starting, January of 2013, and now the dog has caught the car. We're in the Senate, and you're now not just in charge of the digital communications for some upstart candidate, but you're the digital communications director for a U.S. senator. You got 26 million constituents. You have an incredible job. How did you guys process that transition from candidate to elected official?
It's a lot like drinking from a fire hose, to be honest. I'll never forget arriving in Washington, a city that I told myself I would never move to, like, under any circumstance whatsoever. But I did thoroughly enjoy it. Every time I go back there, I miss it. But showing up there, like, literally not knowing where the restrooms are, not knowing where the cafeteria is. Meanwhile, we're running a Senate office for, like you said, one of the largest states in the country, representing 26, at that point, I think it's 27 million Texans. Everyone just keeps moving here. I wonder why.
Out of a basement, by the way.
Yeah, out of a basement. We show up, and it was really quite the awakening getting there, because we didn't move into our actual office suite in the Dirksen building until July of 2013. So in the meantime, we were operating out of this basement space, which is basically 2 big rooms, a bunch of desks lined together, no windows. And as it is in winter, like, you show up there and the sun's down before you get out or get up and get to the office. The sun's down whenever you leave. So, like, you'd go like a week without seeing daylight because you're not going outside. But
it's your fluorescent tan on.
Yeah, the fluorescent lights really do wonders for you. But at the same time, we are figuring out, okay, so what are the Senate ethics rules with what we can use from that we've created in the Senate campaign? Can we use our political Twitter account, the @Ted Cruz account, or should we set up a new one? What are the rules for what we're allowed to do on Facebook versus what we're not allowed to do? And how do we use this to properly engage our constituents and get them to be able to, like, find the resources they need? In the meantime, we're also setting up a new website from scratch. So it just ended up being quite the learning experience. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. And I'll never forget, was it February 20, I want to say 26th. Is that was the
talking about debt ceiling or the gun debate? These are both early in I think February.
Was it Rand Paul's filibuster? It might have been March.
I think Rand's was a little bit later, but early there, right as we're coming out of the blocks, we have some of the gun debates in the committees. Where as soon as Feinstein, there was a big debate with, which got a ton of attention. Then coming out of that, you have, I think early February, you have the debt ceiling, kind of crisis where Ted forces the GOP to actually have a vote on it. Yeah. So, I mean, through this, you're trying to figure out where the bathrooms are and what the basic rules are that you got to follow. Meanwhile, you've got big stuff that you got to be operating communications on.
Yeah. Meanwhile, like you mentioned with Feinstein, that was right off the bat in the Senate, and we were still in the basement offices. Like, we still didn't know where we were going most of the time. If you dropped me in the Capitol, I'd get lost and I'd never find my way out. But like, that was right at the time where, you see Senator Cruz in one of the committee hearings with this sign behind him with just like a Remington rifle, like holding up a pistol grip underneath it, and says, this is the assault weapons ban they're trying to pass right now. You take this pistol grip and you stick it here, and all of a sudden this is an assault weapon that's banned under federal law. This makes no sense. It in no way makes the gun more dangerous. If anything, it probably makes it safer. It looks ridiculous, but that's okay. But we're doing things like that. We're leading fights on. The reason I brought up the Rand Paul's filibuster was this was right off the bat. It might have been March. The reason I asked February 26th or what the date was, because it was right around the time the Battle of the Alamo was going on. The anniversary of the Battle of the Alamo was going on.
That's
we're not
right.
that. And that was the first time Ted spoke on the Senate floor, was going up there to support Rand Paul's filibuster. And one of the things that he did was read from William Barrett Travis's letter from the Alamo. And it was on one of those anniversaries, right around that time period. And one of the things that we did, like, again, we want to make sure people have a voice and feel like that they are part of the political process. We printed out a bunch of tweets from people who were tweeting the hashtag Stand With Rand. And we had Ted go down to the Senate floor, and he was actually reading these tweets in support of Rand Paul. Rand couldn't see them. He couldn't pull out his phone on the Senate floor. He couldn't see people tweeting encouragement, but at least this way he could hear and see that there are people out there doing that. And I'm fairly certain that at some point in a future version of Trivial Pursuit, there will be a question of who was the first U.S. Senator to read tweets on the U.S. Senate floor, and now it will always be Ted Cruz. So
enshrined in Trivial Pursuit history.
Yeah. And then similar to that, one of the things we did in anticipation of the Obamacare filibuster he did in September of 2013, yep. We asked people in advance, well, okay, why do you want to defund Obamacare? And we printed out long lists of them and sent him to the Senate floor for him to be able to read these people's tweets as why they want Obamacare defunded and stopped, and have all of these people's opinions read into the congressional record. And to this day, if you go up to the congressional record, there's Ted Cruz reading, average constituents' tweets, and they'll be enshrined there as long as we're all here. So we just really want to try and find a way for people to feel involved in the political process, for people to feel like their voices are being heard, and find tools for them to be able to do that, I guess, more effectively. So it's been a long ride. It's hard to believe I've been out of D.C. for 2 years now. We did 2 years here with a presidential campaign.
Yeah, you moved to Houston back in 2014 to be our 15. To help start, kick off the presidential campaign. And of course, you weren't actually in Houston very much during those intervening 2 years. Sure. That's for sure. You're on the road quite a bit. But
I left March 6th, the fall of the Alamo, in fact, was the day I left D.C.
Yeah, I just looked it up, and that's actually March 6th was the Rand filibuster, so that's why they were reading Ted was reading the Travis letter from the Alamo. Yeah. Well, Josh, we've like we talked about earlier, we've got a whole other podcast that we're going to have to record on the presidential campaign, which I think will be a don't miss episode. But you got to share a lot today. I thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully this will be something that folks get a lot out of, and really just the idea that we have to be willing to innovate. We have to be willing to try new things, and you guys did that to such great effect. From just being willing to do something, just to be willing to step out there on Twitter and Facebook and try things, be willing to make mistakes, and thankfully you did right more than you did wrong. You did a good job of that. Came out on the winning side of that equation, and I'm really proud, of getting to have our relationship and get to learn so much from you over the years. I will have links to your social media in the in the show notes. Josh is known not only for Ted Cruz stuff, but for being the number one Taylor Swift fan, and being a huge NASA fan. So if you like Taylor Swift or NASA or Ted Cruz, any of those three things, you will definitely enjoy Josh on Twitter and Facebook. So we'll link over to go follow him. We're excited to have you on here sometime soon to talk presidential. And with that, Josh, thank you just so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, guys, check out the show notes for the rest. Check out campaignsidekick.vote to see how they can help your campaign win. And we'll talk to you guys again next week.
Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes to help spread the word. We'll be back with you next week with more campaign insights from My Campaign Coach.